Good, thank you. Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Income Management. This just go through the usual chair's briefing to start with, and then we'll get down to the agenda. Welcome to today's meeting. This is a public meeting, and members of the public and press are permitted to report on the proceedings. Reporting includes filming, photography, making an audio recording, and providing commentary on proceedings. Please note, this meeting is recorded and streamed live. These recordings are published on the relevant meeting page of the Council's website. By choosing to attend this public meeting, you are deemed to have given your consent to being filmed or recorded and for any footage to be broadcast or published. If the alarm sounds, the premises must be evacuated immediately. Do not spend time collecting personal belongings. All emergency escape routes are clearly signed. Once you have left the building, the assembly point is in the High Street opposite the Guildhall. Members and other speakers are reminded to use their microphone when speaking. Slight change to the agenda, but I'll sort of walk you through that in a moment. Just to go on with the agenda as printed then, appointment of substitutes, Julian? Declarations of interest, members? None. And no public participation. The minutes of the last meeting, clearly only Councillor Riaz was actually present as far as I'm aware at that meeting, but if there are any comments or questions that other members want to ask, please do so at this moment. We can go through the page one by one, or you can, I'll assume they've been read and you can ask your questions or comment as you wish. Any questions or comment on those minutes there? Okay, so I will happily sign those when we conclude our business. So before we go into the performance report, Shane has very kindly offered to just do for 5 or 10 minutes, if we can have a sort of summary, particularly for members who've not served on this committee in the past, who might want a little sort of sense of what we've attempted to do here. So Shane.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, councillors. It's nice to see so many new faces on the committee. It's always nice to see so many new faces. And as part of this round of policy committees, we've actually been talking about the agenda for the committees. And it just struck me that in this case, although this is a subcommittee rather than a policy committee, it's worth just giving a bit of background to where we are, because that will contextualise some of the commentary around the commercial strategy and income strategy and where we are with our proposed scorecard and so on. So it really goes back to a paper which was produced by my predecessor, Leslie, I want to say Crowther, but that's not right, is it? Megan, who focused on income as an area that we needed to develop. And there were 3 components to that. One was around realigning our budgets, making sure that our budgets and what we were setting as an income budget, because that feeds into our budget and our medium-term financial plan, were accurate and reasonable and sensible. Secondly, there was a drive to improve our income from the wide range of things that we generate fees and charges from, to put that on a proper footing and have an agreed approach to how we'd raise fees and charges every year and try to see if we can do some targeted marketing and drive that. And then the third were what she referred to as big ticket items. And so there were some, what big things could we actually achieve, which would give us a step forward in terms of the income that we generate. And those have been achieved. All 3 have been introduced and progressed significantly over the past 5 or 6 years. In terms of alignment of our budgets, we moved from a position where we were simply defaulting to last year's actual position to one where we're saying, well, what's the last 3 years' income trend been like? And let's set a budget on the basis of that. And that was very progressive. So we were for a long time setting budget targets which were pushing our income up and driving those responsible for generating income to meet those targets. Now, the last couple of years, COVID sort of intervened in that a little bit and made that more difficult, and we got to a position where income was falling well behind budgets. We've now probably corrected that largely, I think Mark will talk about later, but there are 1 or 2 areas where we're still perhaps budgeting in advance of the actual amounts of income we're getting in, but for the most part, income has caught up with the budgets that we've been setting. So there was a very progressive approach to budget management, and when we talk about the income strategy, I'll come back to that as to whether or not we want to continue with that or take a different approach. So In terms of increasing income through existing activities, there was a good deal of that. I mean, we did look at some additional ones. So I think the lottery was introduced as a way of generating additional income. Whether how far that's been successful, it remains to be seen. We did some work around the Riverside Cafe, relet that, allowed for some improvements in the way that was done. And, you know, we begin to think about other ways that we can generate income. We have advertising on our website and so on and so forth. So all small things, but just trying to get to a more commercial approach. And that's where the commercialization strategy comes from, getting people to think about, well, how can we commercialize it? How can we generate income from it? And recognizing that that is part of our business. You know, I know in some cases in the public sector, we feel a bit squeamish about selling services or doing things to generate income. Surely we're in the business of providing services free at the point of cost for the most part, delivery for the most part. But we've recognized through this committee, this subcommittee, that those things aren't incompatible, that you can still provide a wide range of services. And in fact, you can provide more services free at the point of delivery if you're generating income from other things. So the whole commercial strategy was developed around that. And we are now at a place where, for example, we anticipate that every year, when we come to fees and charges setting, which is responsibility of this committee, our starting point is that they will be inflation level increases in fees and charges, whereas in the past they were often just kept as they were and had been stagnant for a long time. I mean, changing, dare I say it, car parking fees and charges was a major change. It was the first time in, what was it, 14 years that we'd actually reached the point of saying, right, this is something that we've got to do. So that approach, I think, has been developed and has been successful. In terms of the big ticket items, that really was and always has been a focus on whether or not we can invest in new assets which would generate income for us. We looked at a wide range of them, including entire shopping centre, didn't we? What was it called? Retail park that we looked at buying, and in the end decided the risks were too great, so we didn't progress that. But we did buy a couple of buildings on King's Court. We bought 2 buildings there, which are now generating 500,000 or so in income for us every year. Although obviously there are costs as well in terms of associated borrowing with that, but nonetheless, they're significant gains. And they're very low risk and therefore have been good buys. And we continue to try and look at that. But in case you're not familiar with the background, about 4 years ago, the Treasury decided that local authorities were overdoing this borrowing to invest. And between them, SIPFA and the Treasury decided that to prevent councils borrowing from the Public Works Loan Board, which was our source of low interest capital, if they were doing it purely to invest. Okay, so they simply closed down the shutters on that. So that the opportunities for generating income from investments in assets are now very, very low. So although we've been successful in doing it, we can still do it, but we need to be focusing on things which are regeneration projects and which are housing projects, for example, because those are exempt from those rules. We can still do those, but it probably needs a lot more investment and they will take a long time. It's not simply buying an ongoing asset or a going concern. So they are still part of the agenda. So we kind of, in a sense, thought that much of the work this committee was set up to do has been completed, and we've done that. Where do we go from here? And if you're looking around at what other opportunities are, significant opportunities, no one has any silver bullets. There's no bright ideas out there. There was even an article in the Municipal Journal this week talking about, is commercialisation finished as a project for local authorities? They came to the conclusion it wasn't, but the focus is now, as I said, much more around regeneration and how we're investing in the city to generate income rather than generating surplus or profit for the council to spend on services. Okay, so that's where we've got to at this point. So we now need to revisit some of our strategies around what we're trying to do, understand better about what we want to do about managing income. But the responsibility of the committee still focuses on ensuring that we're driving that, scrutinizing it, giving it sufficient focus, and on an annual basis at least, reviewing fees and charges and making recommendations through to the committee through to Policy and Resources Committee and Council as part of the budget setting process. So Freedom Leisure's fees and charges come here. all the charges for trade waste, garden waste, bulky waste, etc., all come here for consideration. Okay, and that's written into the Constitution. So that remains a key function of this committee. Okay. Any questions, or everyone happy with that?
See the basis of the report of in the local government journal. You were saying in terms of understand the evidence base that they use. Were they arguing that the powers under the Localism Act that gave councils the power to well, develop a commercial element to their operations, that has not been fully utilised, or was that not used to best effect? What were they trying to argue in that, or was it because of recent cost pressures that councils weren't able to carry out that function correctly? I'm keen to understand, was it the not best use of the law that had been changed, or the fact that the resources weren't there in order to carry out the laws that were changed?
I think actually it was a combination of those, but there was a third element which was part of the article which was discussed, which was around the ethical aspects of it. You know, coming back to this point about, is it the function of local authorities to be acting as businesses, to go out and commercially pursue income, you know, in a way which you know, doesn't necessarily bring benefits to local people, but simply brings in income which we can then use for other things. So that was a third dimension to that. But yes, I think the sense of it was that, you know, it was a round table discussion from which that article was based, and there was a wide range of views from the point of view of, well, we haven't got any money as a local authority, we've got to go out and get it, you know, in a fairly pragmatic sort of way, all the way to the other end saying, well, this is not our business, we shouldn't be doing that. And you know, the Treasury have put in rules, not because they just wanted to, but because they could see the problems that it creates trying to apply capitalist theology to a ideology, I should say, rather than theology, to a public sector ethos, that they're not compatible. So that debate has always been there, hasn't it? In fact, we've discussed it a few times, some of the things that we've looked at. Or should we, I remember Adrian teasing me about tax avoidance at one stage on one of the things that we were looking into. So there are ethical considerations form part of that discussion. That seems to me the bit that stuck in my mind about the article. So it's not the end of the road, but we still need to think about what does that mean, commercialism, for us, and how do we go about finding the right balance so that we do generate sufficient income to deliver services and set our, you know, our balanced medium-term financial plan, but at the same time stick to our core purpose, which is to deliver effective services for local people.
Any further comment or questions related to that? Tom.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm really grateful also for suggesting this scene setting, because it's been very helpful. So thank you to you both. I mean, to be honest with you, to me, it's not purely the issue of semantics. I think applying the ideology or the language, the idiom of business is probably unfortunate. I mean, I work for a non-for-profit organization myself. We don't have an issue with talking about surplus. Another way of putting it would be generating community wealth or wealth within the community or local economy. I have two questions in terms of, and it's probably not falling within the remit of this committee, but thinking about a council which adopted a model of circular economy, a Labour-led council actually up in the northwest. Does procurement and limiting costs fall within the remit? I'm thinking about Preston City Council and the Preston model as just one example. So trying to attract investment from the outside into the area, into the city, and working in partnership while trying to attract this investment. with what they call anchor organizations. So university, county council, Lancashire, in that case, colleges and a few major businesses. So that's my first question. And procurement is where the savings actually, it's not about generating surplus or income, however you want to put it. It's about saving lots and lots of money in terms of cost expenditure and how things are procured. The second question proper is, in terms of, I know that LEP has a role in terms of attracting investment here, but how much attention is being paid in the income, what are we calling it? It's income strategy, as it is at the moment. How much attention are we paying, to attracting investment into Worcester? So those are my two questions. Hopefully they are clear enough and make sense.
Okay, I've rehearsed this a number of times in various committees, but I recall very strongly when I did my job interview, going back to the days of Leslie Meager, and asking a question about partners that the City Council has, and getting, forgive me, Adrian, what I felt at the time was a rather thin answer as to the degree in which we were engaging with partners on a number of things. And I think that has significantly changed over time. I think we're in a much more better position with regard to that degree of engagement. And it's borne fruit in things like the major capital programs that we've had investment in. So that has involved significant partnerships with the County Council, with the university through the Towns Fund, for example, the new Health and Wellbeing Centre. How much can you say, well, that was due to the fact that the City Council was put in its Towns Fund bid and attracted that investment in partnership. And we've also had good partnership working through the Arches project as well. So there is a much stronger, I think, platform for doing that. And in respect of the procurement element, I don't think we're anywhere near that, Tom, to be honest. And it's not something that's really found its way to the forefront of our thinking in terms of whether we can do joint procurement or work on joint assets, for example. We haven't done very much of that. There's been some talk about, as the county perhaps has freed up some of the use of the county, what opportunities are there for joining up there and so on and so forth. So I don't think we have gone very far in respect of that, but I certainly think we're in a better position now than we were in terms of the way that we've attracted public funding into the city. We've been extremely successful at that and done that through partnership working. As to how far the income strategy pays attention to inward investment, it doesn't particularly. That is an area which we know that we've got to strengthen, and it's one of the things that we're beginning to think about now in terms of our medium-term financial plan. One of the items which will be coming forward in the P&R committee discussion in July will be around sponsorships and how we can engage better with local businesses to support some of the things that we want to deliver. Some of the events that we put on, can we engage advertising and so on and so forth. And we've explored elements of that, but in a relatively small way. And there is one element of why the Treasury and CIPFA were concerned about what local authorities were doing was about capacity. I think it was something that Jabba touched on when we recently talked about a major investment. Do we have the skills and expertise and knowledge, capacity and understanding to engage effectively in that kind of commercial inward investment activity? And that's, some would say yes, and some would say not so much. So that is a factor to take into account. That's something we perhaps will need to build up if we're going to successfully increase our investment into the city over time. So those are really important areas to think about. I think to some extent, the focus of this committee based on that, because it was based around that agenda, which Leslie said, has been a little narrow. And we could perhaps think a bit much wider in terms of, we're investing in the city rather than simply generating in order to deliver services. So there's much scope to broaden that out.
Thank you. Anything, Adrian?
I'd just like a bit more clarification about the remit of the committee, really, Shane, I think. Just on the back of what you just said. When this started, it was an income generation subcommittee, because as part of the policy, part of our strategy as a city council was to generate income in various ways. It altered to be income management, which is now basically, in my view, a monitoring exercise, tick boxing of what officers have done in terms of how successful or otherwise officers have been on the various projects which generate income, like the Guildhall or bereavement services or tradeways. So we're sat around just saying, well done, or do better. Great. And when we had this conversation about the purpose of this committee at the council meeting, the emphasis from certain members around the building was, no, we can't get rid of this committee because it is vital, because we have to generate income, because we have to survive as a council, we have to find other ways to do it. So what is it? What are we here for? Because at the moment, all I can see is a bit of navel gazing through this process. And if you want to actually do something about driving the income benefits of the council, then that is about how the council operates and the council services. It's not about getting partners to invest in the city. It's about how do we survive as a council. That's the fundamental problem we've got. If you want to do that, that's fine, but let's look at what the terms of reference of the committee are in order to do it, because I don't think we're clear about what those are at the moment.
Thank you, Chair. Yes. That you've articulated very effectively, as always, the debate that we were having some weeks ago around what is the purpose of the committee and what's its function. Constitutionally, it still has a function around monitoring and setting income targets, but it also has a scrutiny role to play in terms of the commercial strategy and the income strategy, both of which I know I need to write, and I need to have some forum to bring them to say, well, is this the right way to go in terms of our generating income in the future? And indeed, they could go straight through to the parent committee, to policy and resources, and given the scale of what we're talking about, then that's potentially the right place for them. But it's not for me to determine whether or not the committee is the right way, right place to have that, and we need to perhaps discuss potentially outside the committee the terms of reference that it should have.
Chair, if I may, I mean, that's my point really, because you earlier on, Shane, you talked about what's coming up to the policy committee next. Now, why is it going to policy committee? Why is it not coming here? And I think that's the dichotomy we've got. And I, with all respect to you, Shane, what I'd really like to hear from is other members of the council telling me what it is that they want this committee to do, because I voted to abolish it.
Okay, perhaps if I came in at that point, because I suspect that's where Adrian's driving towards. I see this, and I take Shane's point about, and yours, Adrian, about defining the purpose of the committee. There's kind of two elements to this for me. One is the question of income, and I fully accept that we're working within changed parameters now. I do think there is a serious role for scrutiny in this, and Shane, you've used the word on 2 or 3 occasions, and that comes out of the name change, essentially, from income generation to income management. The fact that there is, we're still dealing with a huge amount of public money, and I personally think that extra layer of scrutiny has value all of its own. Now, whether or not, in the fullness of time, this committee, in its current iteration, goes forward is maybe for others to decide. But I do think one of the reasons why I made that point at council is because I still believe that there is a real purpose for a subcommittee beneath its parent committee, P&R, where we could have some serious value, both in terms of talking about what the council is doing in order to generate income, but also how it is spending it. And I think those two things are not incompatible and could still be worked through in a meaningful way in this committee. Now, as I say, in the fullness of time, numbers may change, and you may decide that that's not a route you want to take. But personally, I think that as we sit today, I still believe it has a value. Any further questions or comment on Shane's sort of summary of the committee itself, or how we go forward? Okay, and I do take on board, and perhaps I could work with Jabber on this in terms of how we get a proper definition of what the committee actually is seeking to achieve, and I'm sure he'll want to be part of that conversation. Okay, so we can go back to the agenda as printed. We'll go to agenda item 5 and Q4 annual performance report. Mark, will you be taking this, or is it Shane? I'm not sure.
Through you, Chair, I'll cover the project elements, and then Mark can cover the income aspects for us, if that's okay. So hopefully that some of that will contextualise the commentary around the commercial strategy and income strategy delivery. So these are documents which were developed in the light of that programme of work that we perceived that we needed to do. And so they focused more in recent times around those bits of inward investment that we've been able to get involved in. So for instance, the Future High Streets Fund, the Towns Fund, and so on and so forth. The major part of the Future High Streets Fund, obviously, is the development of the Scala building, and we've been able successfully to transfer some of the funding which we proposed for some other elements of that, which have fallen by the wayside, into that. There is still a funding gap there, and we're looking to close that by applying for external funding from Heritage Lottery and other potential funding partners. So there'll be certainly more information on that at the Policy and Resources Committee in due course. You will note that we were unsuccessful in the levelling up bid. That's just noting that in passing. We now know that there is. We don't know it. We have had indications that there will be another opportunity to look at levelling up. But unfortunately, probably again with the same sort of short time scale. So I suppose the advantage is that we've got projects which we had before, which we can bring forward without doing a bit more work on them. The indications are that that we'd be more successful applying for one project rather than 3 that we did last time. So that's just conversations that the MD has had with colleagues from the department, which have suggested that. So none of that may transpire, but that's our understanding at the moment. So there's an opportunity there. Since we last met, the cultural development has been extended, so we have got until July 2024 to get that expletive deleted building down, which was formerly Jack's Chicken Shop. With the planning application is due to go in very shortly, and that means we can then go on and tender for somebody to come along and do the demolition work for us. And we're just then waiting on the Network Rail to let us know when the lines will be closed so we can get on with that work. I mentioned the major proposal we talked about here and also at Policy and Resources several times recently around affordable housing acquisitions, but I think in summary, the expected costs of that substantially outweighed the benefits. So it was taken that was no longer going to go forward. I have to say we've had continued contact, but have continued to state that we're not pursuing that in its current form. So it's not to say we won't look at it in other forms, but that proposal is now completed. So I need to reset the commercial strategy in the light of where we are at the moment, also taking into account our medium-term financial plan issues, which we're working through at the moment. So we'll be bringing a revised version of the committee during the course of the year for consideration.
Questions or comment on that, please? Jabba, sorry, yes.
So the income strategy was really around our approach to setting our targets for income every year and trying to work out an actual approach which we could agree was the right way to do that. And again, there are member considerations around that, because simply setting a blank rate of fees and charges does have a potential impact on those on low incomes, for example, and can be exclusive in the way that you do that. So it's important that we have an agreed approach, which we've tried to do. So this time, as noted in February, we did set that increase in car parking charges, and on the whole, achieved an increase in income of 7.5%. And Mark will take us through the impact of that. Business rates is one of the areas that we're focusing on at the moment, because there has been some issues, particularly in respect. This was something which again was reported, I think just today. I saw an article about a significant number of businesses that had faced legal issues with local authorities, because for some years now, and we've got into years, we haven't been pursuing that process of formally seeking legal action in respect of unpaid business rates. So we're now getting to the point where we need to put that back in place. So there are potential significant debts which have arisen in recent years because of the COVID situation, and we're now starting to work our way through that. What we do know is that the government has postponed any intention of revising the business rates base. So we know that at least we can keep that growth that we've got, and if we continue to achieve growth, then we'll continue to get it. And one other aspect of income, which tends to get overlooked, I know that interest rate rises aren't good if you have a mortgage and so on and so forth, but for those of us who have significant cash balances, it's quite a beneficial thing. You know, obviously there's a downside in putting up costs, but our income from investments has improved considerably and may continue. In terms of the sports facilities, then, just to finish that off, so I mentioned last time that we had been approached by the hockey, and again, for those of you who weren't part of this in the background, a couple of years ago, again pre-COVID, so it must be at least 4 years ago now, we arranged an arrangement with RGS and Worcester Hockey to acquire a piece of our land and to build a international standard hockey facility on it. Once they'd reached the point of completion, we would then fund that for them at the price of £2 million, and they would pay us interest on that in lieu of the rent which we would have had for the land. Up until this point, they have yet to reach practical completion because they'd had a lot of problems with the person who was building the pavilion for them. And when we last met, we got to the point where they were now starting to bring that forward, but had yet failed to do that. So we are still in a position where they've not drawn down the loan, which when they finally do, we will then be able to generate income from in terms of interest on the money. As an interesting aspect of that, the interest rates since it was done 3 years ago, have risen considerably. So that will actually make it more difficult for them in terms of meeting the commitments that they made at the time in terms of the loan. So I'm anticipating a conversation about that at some stage, but we've not had it yet. The latest contact we've had from them is that they've reached the point of completing the works. We're just waiting for a follow-up call in respect of the legals, which they've been after us for a while, but as of today, we've yet to hear from them. So it's not yet complete, but it's just that last bit to do now, just to actually sort out the legal aspects.
Mark, anything?
I think you
No. Can I perhaps kick off a question here in terms of interest rates? Now, yeah, clearly interest rates and the economic and social impact of them rising or falling can't be seen in sort of isolation. They have an impact positively in a sense for us in terms of our investments, but also there will be people who are struggling to cope with mortgages at the moment and so forth. However, I guess the essence of the question is, if inflation falls, if the economy benefits from that and the Bank of England sees an opportunity to reduce interest rates down to something approaching the levels that we were getting used to for a number of years, how would that impact? Because clearly it's had a positive impact in terms of our investments so far. Were it to go in the other direction, is that how are we going to look at that then? Because clearly, you know, one of the things we're here to discuss is how we could generate income. There is an income generated from this in that sense. So I guess the question is, you know, if they move downwards, if there is a general trend downwards, what sort of impact will that have on our investments? And, you know, if we're not seeing anything substantial, you know, to counterbalance that, how would that impact on our funding position in perhaps 2 to 3 years' time?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, it's always going to be a short-term consideration in terms of the interest rates, whether they go up or go down. And the two things go in parallel. So if interest rates are coming down, then of course inflation is coming down, and therefore we don't have the same cost impact. So they should, to some extent, run in parallel. I guess the point is that quite often when we're thinking about our budgets and our medium-term plan, we are focusing on the cost side of that and what we can generate in income from fees and charges, and looking at the gap. And it's often we suddenly realise almost, you know, oh, well, there's all this extra money that's come from interest rates. So it's almost as a bonus. And I think I can't remember, Mark, what we put in terms of assumptions in the longer term, but I suspect that they are below what interest rates currently are. So they will be a benefit going forward, as long as interest rates remain above those levels.
Yes, when we set the budget back in the early part of the year, nobody foresaw the fact that interest rates would peak to where they are now, and according to all the press articles, are still likely to go up further. That means in the short term, the next year or so, providing we can keep the cash balances that we can invest, then the interest is likely to exceed what we budgeted. We then assumed over the next 2 or 3 years that would come back down again.
Yeah, and then the other side of that, of course, is the borrowing side. So we are benefiting from the increased interest rates because our borrowing is fixed and was fixed some time ago when interest rates were relatively low. But we're reaching a point where we're probably going to need to stop borrowing again before too long. And of course, that's going to be at a much higher level. And then there's a question for us to decide whether we then borrow at a variable rate in the event that we expect interest rates to come down again, and we take advantage of that. Otherwise, we become exposed and end up paying a lot. Remember the famous Lobo loan, which we're still paying for? Are we anywhere near actually getting to a point where that's worth paying off, by the way? No.
Well, we looked at that a couple of years ago, and no, it wasn't. There's lots of councils in this position. We're not unusual in this respect, and there are 1 or 2 who've paid theirs off, but most councils are sitting on them as we are doing.
Right. Any further comment on that particular part of the paper itself? Eleanor.
Thank you, Chair. Can you just clarify a bit more when you said about unpaid business rates? Am I correct in what you said in that you were going to pursue unpaid business rates? Is that correct? And if so, are you able to give us a figure as to what the current unpaid business rates amount is?
Through you, Chair, we are going to pursue unpaid business rates through the course, as we always do. So it's always worth remembering that we're the billing authority. We collect business rates, but we collect it on behalf of ourselves, of the county council, and of the Treasury, which takes 50% of the growth on our business rates. And in fact, it takes a lot more than that, which it then redistributes to other authorities. So we have a set process for following up through the courts for unpaid business rates, because it's a legal requirement to pay them. Those have been relaxed in recent times because of the COVID issue, where we knew a lot of businesses would be struggling with that. So we, in many cases, made arrangements. In some cases, we've simply put the legal process in abeyance until such a time as we felt that, you know, it's time to put it right. And so we reached that point now. We've started to issue summonses again at the early part of this year. I cannot put a figure on it. It's a very movable feast, and you always have to remember that the amounts that are in debt that are owed are only a portion of which are going to fall to this authority. So it'd be a question of saying, you know, if the debt were £1 million, is it the 100,000 which is ours, or is it 50% of the growth which is ours? Or you know, it's very, very difficult to put a figure on that. The best way of showing it is looking at our recovery rate. So if you look at the recovery rate of business rates during the course of the year, now I'm always wary of picking any particular point in time, because you could just have one or two very, very high ones, supermarkets, for example, which when they come through, change the figures considerably. But I can provide some information around that, Eleanor, if you want to know more. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Did you want to say anything specifically in terms of the KPI, Shane? Mark, yeah?
Did you have a question?
Sorry, Jeff.
Follow up on the whole.
Skip through the specific graphs and we can pick up on some of the points that Shane referred to when he was speaking. The first one's the Riverside related income. As Shane said, this is property related in the main, and it's obviously fixed because the properties are on leases. So, for example, the Riverside Cafe that Shane referred to. Just in case anybody spotted it, there is a typo right in the middle of that page where it says 250,000. I wish, obviously, that should be 2,500. Slip of my finger, I'm afraid. The next one is the Guildhall, this building. So obviously, this the income generated here suffered considerably during the pandemic and the periods of lockdown. It's also led us to review the types of activity that we rent the building out for. And we've taken the view that holding large private parties and weddings is probably too much of a risk in a building of this type, and therefore we're going to focus more on commercial events, which are easier to stage and manage. Hence, the income is lower than it's been pre-pandemic. There was a considerable spike at the end of last year, up to 25,000, which was certainly welcome, but was a bit of a one-off. Obviously, a lot of that related to bookings that will happen during the new year. And to put that into context, I can tell you that for April and May, bookings have returned to a much more normal level of, I think, just over 5,000, 6,000 for the 2 months. The next one, trade waste, positive news story here. You can see if you look across the green and orange lines that we've gradually, over the last 2 years, closed the gap and got closer to achieving the budget. The budget was set when we, at the higher level, when we took on the university contract, and we've struggled to get up to that level. But as you can see, the gap has closed. And again, I can confirm that in April and May, that trend has continued to the point where in May, we're now, for the first 2 months of this year, in line with the budget, which is good news, and therefore is the highest income we've generated so far from trade waste. Similar story in garden waste, although obviously for different customer base and different reasons, but here we're exceeding the budget. During the pandemic and lockdown, we had quite a lot of new accounts opened, suited people to have their garden waste collected rather than trying to take it to the refuse centres themselves. And touch wood, those accounts have renewed, and we're continuing to attract new accounts as well. So again, for the first 2 months of this year, we're ahead of the budget, and that's in spite of the price increase that was applied from the 1st of April. Property, the spike up here towards the end of the year in the graph does reflect the fact that some of the rent reviews we've been able to agree at higher than the amounts we'd assumed in the budget, but more that the income we're generating from the EV chargers we've installed at St Martin Gate is now included in here. And at the time we set the budget a year ago, that wasn't planned. So hence the uplift there. There is, of course, the cost associated with doing that, but it's still an activity for us that is generating a small surplus, which is good, and of course has environmental benefits as well. Car parks, far and away our largest revenue stream. You can see the numbers at the bottom there. A positive story here. Hopefully this is going to continue. Again, you can see the gap between the budget and the actual has gradually closed to the point where at the end of the year, we were, for the final quarter, we were back on budget. We'd spent most of the year around 10% short, which we were putting down to a combination of people working from home regularly now, as a 1, 2, 3 days a week, and therefore not coming into the office and parking, and also increased internet shopping. From the 1st of April, the tariffs went up. We therefore put the budget up as well. And so far, after the 2 months, we are achieving that budget, which suggests that the price increase hasn't deterred people from parking, and that that trend, again, we talked about home working, internet shopping, has perhaps started to reverse, and people are coming to the city more. So perhaps too early to confirm that as a permanent trend, but it's going in the right direction. The next couple are not quite so positive, I'm afraid. Bereavement, we've talked here before about the fact that there are increasing bookings going to the new crematorium at Fladbury rather than coming to Astwood, and that continues to be the case. We're still running short of the budget and are doing so in April and May of the new year. I think obviously out of the pandemic, the pattern has pretty much settled down. We've got a fairly even graph there, but that's going to continue, I think, to be a challenge for us from an income point of view. Similarly in development management, so planning, land charges, building control. Again, you can see a fairly marked reduction from the income in 21-22 through into 22-23 just finished. Perhaps surprisingly, the pandemic and the periods of lockdown didn't seem to have a great impact on our income in this service. But for last year, we were running for between 70 and 75% of the previous year. And again, in April and May, that trend's continue. It's a combination of the fact that we're getting fewer planning applications than we were previously, and particularly not getting any of the larger ones that we've had before. And last but not least, neighbourhood income. So this is predominantly the income we generate from the county council for the services we do on their behalf, particularly taking the street sweepings up to the disposal point at Wolverhampton. But also for other one-off project work, for example, when there's flooding and so on. Significant spike towards the end of the year. Now this, as I said, this income flow does depend on the amount of work that they're requesting from us, but it's also because despite my persistence with the team who raised the invoices, they tend to focus more on the delivery than the paperwork, shall we say. So there tends to be a catch-up at the end of the year, which is certainly evident in this one. It started the new year off fairly slowly, but there's no reason why we shouldn't achieve the budget on this one. I think that's it.
Mark, thank you. Questions KPI related? Tom.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Mark. I think I've got 3 questions. Number 1, why is Guildhall singled out? I do appreciate in terms of income from the bookings. Do we take bookings from anywhere else? I'm curious, and please forgive my naivety or the lack of knowledge on this subject matter. Question number 2, the car parking charges. I think in terms of, I'm relieved because there were all kinds of sort of concerns from certain sectors within the council and chamber that it's going to affect people visiting our business and businesses are spending money locally. This doesn't seem to be transpiring, and I think, as you mentioned, that there are health benefits as well to added to it. So the question around the car parking is there a way of thinking about achieving the sweet spot of having people moving around the city, and perhaps considering a potential sort of look at the charges at the moment. So in you know a thinking exercise, whether, considering this is a big ticket number, whether this could be maximized. And finally, on page number 19, so this goes back to my point about partners, because I think that's the whole thinking in my mind. Perhaps I haven't explained this very well. It's not only saving money in terms of procurement, so I don't know, doing grass, I don't know, catering together or grass maintenance together, but it's also the case of offering certain in-house services to public sector partners and maybe others as well. So is this being looked into as an example of somewhere where we can extend? So I'll give you an example from my day-to-day work. My employer has an in-house trades arm of business, and we use it for maintenance of our properties, but we of course use it as well to provide maintenance for other housing providers. 3 questions. Sorry, I should have probably taken a break after each.
I'll try and take those in order. If Shane wants to add into any of it, then I'm sure he'll shout it. First, in terms of the Guildhall, yes, you're right, we generate income from other council properties, but from a room hire point of view, the Guildhall is by far the greatest. So, for example, at the Museum and Art Gallery, there is, if you look at the fees and charges, some opportunities there to generate income, but it's quite small, and that's included as part of the museum income overall. Similar at the Commandery, where there's more opportunity. So, for example, they'll do weddings at the Commandery, and let's say a handful of other events. Again, that income's then reported as part of the museum's income. The car parking question, I'm really not sure what to say here. I think before, if you rolled back 3 or 4 months, and we were talking about applying a 8-9% increase to our parking charges, there was considerable concern about what that might do to the revenue, as there had been for a number of years. As I said, when we looked at the income, the early signs are, stress the early signs, that at the moment that doesn't seem to have affected the demand. As part of doing that, we looked at our tariffs to be sure that they were going to be competitive both with neighbouring towns and with other car park providers in the city, to be sure that we weren't doing anything that was out of kilter. And I think that needs to be and will be an ongoing process. Whether we found that sweet spot, as you call it, I really can't say. Your last question, yes, raises a good, valid point. I think one of the things to say here is that we talked about procurement before. A number of our activities are part of shared services with other local authorities, which gives us the benefit of economies of scale in those, particularly from a management point of view. And for example, we provide the internal audit service for I think all the county now, or most of it, which is certainly cost effective for us. And because of that, procurement becomes a far less significant activity for us because we've already got most of those services covered, with most of those shared services managed by other councils. So we're not doing we don't do the procurement for them. And that offering of services is something we still look at, and I'll look for other opportunities, but I think it's, well, interesting in Shane's comment, I think it's to do it for other parties is limited, but it's not something that we should dismiss.
Well, I need to say, we do carry out a number of services on behalf of the county council, which we charge for, and that does result in some regular discussions around what the value of is provided at what cost. So it's complicated, and to also coming back to your point earlier, Tom, about working across other authorities. So a number of councils did try to drive that agenda quite significantly. I think some of those in Cheshire in particular were selling services across the board. We're really branching out and talking to other local authorities about they could deliver services for them. And on the whole, those are retrenched. It hasn't, I can't think of an example anywhere where that's been significantly successful. The local authorities have ramped up business which they can sell on to the local authorities.
Yes, I wasn't necessarily thinking about local authorities only. So university comes to mind, and as I said, in my mind, yes, there is the legal bit and the procurement framework and so on to consider, but things like catering, just on top of my head, I didn't come prepared to talk about it in detail, but grounds maintenance or catering, or there are certainly certain things that you can look into. So that just a clarification. I wasn't necessarily talking about local authorities only.
Thank you, Chair. Just looking at the land charges figures and planning revenue, obviously I'm new to this committee, very naive, but when were the land charges last reviewed and increased?
Thank you, through you, Chair. So each year we review fees and charges as a whole, which I think Shane said comes through this committee and then goes on to P&R and ultimately council as part of the budget setting process. Land charges and planning is part of that process. However, most of the development management fees are set by government as a statutory, and so we don't have any control over that. Where we do, then they're part of that process, and as Shane said, by and large, we're putting them up by the rate of inflation.
Just to say, excuse me, from my perspective, I mean, the car park fees and charges question is, I suspect we wouldn't have been doing our job properly if we hadn't approached that question with a degree of caution of the impact on the local economy. The high street is fragile, and any change in our car park fees and charges, we had to approach with a degree of caution. The fact that on the basis of the data we have available, that impact is, not what we possibly might have anticipated, is to be applauded. And I hope that continues. I mean, clearly we're only working with limited data, but it should be, there's the politics of it that we'll work through. But I mean, inevitably, the fact that the data is demonstrating that the fears that some of us had may not be entirely what is coming through is something I'm personally more than happy to see continue. So, any further comment on those KPIs? Tom, please. Yeah.
Sorry, and this is not going to be about sweet spots or anything like that. It's just this Guildhall thing. I'm thinking, would it make sense to have something that says that pulls up other venues, other assets together with this. And I do appreciate that there is scope for, in terms of how much money is generated through this building, and others might differ. Just a thought.
I think the potential thing we could do there would be to add in another table, another graph to this to show the museum's income. It would be a manual exercise to split out the room hire from the other sites, which is pretty small, to add it to the Guildhall one. But what would be perhaps more useful would be to show the museum's income as a whole, because that does fluctuate, and when we include it, you'll see it's quite a positive success story in terms of the income that it's managed to generate over the period since pre-pandemic. Albeit, and this may be Adrian's point, I don't know, that the museum service is a joint service with the county council, and therefore the income that we're generating isn't solely the responsibility of this committee.
Adrian.
Yeah, it would be purely for your interest, not your activity, if we were to do that.
Any further questions or comment? So if members are happy to note the contents of that report. Okay. So we'll go from agenda item 5 to agenda item 6 and the proposed committee performance scorecard 23-24. Gentlemen.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not a great deal to add to what was discussed earlier. The main focus now is on getting our commercial strategy revised, our income strategy revised. Those are the key bits of business during the rest of the year. I mean, whatever projects or proposals might fall out of that could then form part of the agenda for the committee if it goes forward in whatever shape it goes forward. We've taken away the housing enabling strategy. That work is complete. All the work around affordable housing and housing enabling is now running through the Communities Committee, and similarly the sports facilities development. The whole key is the project is complete. We just need to finish the legals on that. The all-weather pitch at Perth as well. There's a report going to Communities Committee, or just went to Community Committee, just been, yeah. So that's being dealt with there. And in terms of the KPI, so we have a revision then to bring on the museums onto the scorecard so we can monitor progress against that. Can I just ask Mark, I can't remember, so in terms of car parking income, we included £150,000 reduction in the target, didn't we? As part of the budget. So the figure that we've got there, does that include that £150,000 reduction? And the increases which we put in just?
Yes.
Yeah.
Table with the 22-23 target, 3.4 target.
Yeah.
The increase in car park from 3.3 to 3.5 million, the combination of the 8 or 9% increase in the tariffs.
Year.
Jabba, did you want to say something?
So just thank you, Mark. Just in terms of the revision for the Guildhall, then from 100 to 35,000, is that correct? Can we just have a clarification why that significant reduction?
So the 100,000 was a budget that had gradually been increased over several years as a means of trying to drive income and from room hire events and so on. The actual income peaked, I think, at 67, might be 69,000, which was the year pre-pandemic. Obviously then was significantly below that. As I said before, the team here have then reviewed the staging of large parties, weddings and so on, which are good income earners. But if you imagine you've got probably 100 people upstairs, a small team here trying to manage it. We've got valuable artwork and so on upstairs. The risk of damage to that or to the building as a whole has to be weighed against the income that we're generating from that. And so we took the view that it was more realistic to rein back from those large events and to focus more on commercial things like vintage clothes fairs and the like, and hence the reduction in income. Remains to be seen. This year will be the test whether 35,000 is a realistic budget or whether we can exceed that.
Okay, so if you just let me be clear then. So are you saying the risk of a party going out of control and alcohol or other things, alcohol induced at that party might cause damage to the significant artifacts within the Guildhall was the risk? Or is it a lack of ambition on our behalf and lack of resources that we're not willing to pursue that? Because surely historic buildings across the UK that hire themselves out have appropriate risks and risk measures and insurances and mitigating factors in place.
Through you, Chair, the process was in recognising the risks which are there through any event. There needs to be sufficient coverage in terms of staff and so on. We hadn't taken sufficient account of the costs of doing that when we were arranging those events. And in particular, we'd started things like running a bar, which meant that we'd had additional costs incurred in respect of that we were incurring overtime to make sure that people could clear up afterwards and make sure that the venue was ready for the next day, none of which was recognised when we began to deliver those kind of events. So when we actually started to analyse what the costs were against the income we were achieving, it became self-evident that it wasn't beneficial in terms of income. So it wasn't that we perceived an increased risk, it's just that we were recognising those risks right from the start, but the costs of mitigating them hadn't been taken into account when we decided we'd do it. So at that point we started to think, well, we can scale back. One of the things, we can still generate income, but do it in a way where the risks are much lower, therefore we need less staff to participate.
Okay, thank you. So just to follow up, so the figure that you were alluding to, Mark, the 67,000 when it peaked, was a gross figure rather than a net figure. Okay, understood. All right.
It'd be something that Jabra and I, through the briefing and agenda planning process, I want to follow through the year, essentially, just to see how that works through. So any further comment or questions relating to that particular report? No. I'm assuming therefore that due consideration of it has taken place, and we can move on to, well, I'm not aware of any other business that has been sort of flagged up. Happy to take any now if you wish. No. So therefore we simply need to ask the question whether we're prepared to